Monuments are meant to preserve history. But what do they actually preserve? A moment? A person? Or a version of the past chosen by someone, at a specific time? Here's the reveal. Monuments are not neutral records. They are constructed, placed, funded, approved. Each one reflects decisions shaped by politics, culture, and power. Here's the deeper question. Who makes those decisions? Governments? Communities? Victors of conflict? Because history is not only remembered, it is selected. Here's the correction to a common assumption. Monuments don't tell the full story. They highlight certain events, figures, or values, while others are reduced, simplified, or left out entirely. Some historians argue they can even reshape memory, turning complex history into a single, fixed narrative. So what are we really looking at when we see a statue? Not just the past, but the moment it was built. The intentions behind it. The message it was meant to send. Because monuments do more than remember. They influence how societies understand themselves. They reinforce identity. Sometimes, they reinforce power. And over time, their meaning changes. What one generation honors, another may question. So the real tension isn't just about history. It's about interpretation. Because every monument answers one question. What should be remembered? But leaves another unanswered. What has been left behind? The pyramids of Giza. Built for kings, but by whom? That question sits at the center of one of history's most studied monuments. The pyramids of Giza rise as symbols of royal power, tombs designed for pharaohs, engineered to endure eternity. Here's the reveal. For a long time, popular imagination suggested enslaved labor. But archaeological evidence points elsewhere. Here's the correction to the myth. Most modern research supports that the pyramids were built by skilled and organized workers, likely paid laborers or state-supported crews, not enslaved populations. Excavations near the Giza Plateau reveal worker settlements, tools, and burial sites placed with care, suggesting status and recognition rather than forced anonymity. Here's the deeper tension. The monuments honor pharaohs whose names are carved into stone. But the people who physically shaped those stones are largely unnamed in the surviving record. Some evidence points to organized national-scale labor systems, communities rotating in and out of construction roles, supported with food, housing, and medical care. So the question shifts slightly. Not just who built them, but why their names were never meant to be part of the monument itself. The Parthenon. Symbol of democracy, or empire? That question reshapes how this monument is seen. On the surface, the Parthenon stands as a defining image of ancient Greece, order, proportion, civic pride. But its origins are tied to a specific moment in power, not just philosophy. Here's the reveal. The Parthenon was built in the 5th century BCE during the height of Athenian dominance. Here's the correction to the myth. It was funded largely during the period when Athens led the Delian League, a military and financial alliance that required contributions, often in the form of tribute from member city-states. Over time, those funds became deeply intertwined with Athenian state-building and major public works, including monumental architecture. Here's the deeper tension. The same city that associated itself with early democratic ideals was also exercising influence over allied states through financial obligation and political control. So what does the Parthenon represent? A celebration of civic identity? A religious dedication to Athena? Or a visible expression of Athenian power at its peak? The evidence supports all three readings, but not equally. Because monuments rarely carry a single meaning. They reflect the society that built them. And the system that made them possible. The Arch of Titus. Victory monument, or trauma marker? That question depends on where you stand in history. The Arch of Titus was built to commemorate the victory of Titus and the Roman campaign in Judea. Here's the reveal. The monument celebrates triumph, procession, spoils of war, imperial success. But it also depicts something else. Here's the correction to the myth. On its inner reliefs, Roman soldiers carry sacred objects taken from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, including the menorah. The imagery is not abstract. It is specific, identifiable, documented in Roman art and historical accounts of the triumphal procession. Here's the deeper tension. For Rome, this was victory made visible in stone. For others, it represents the destruction of a sacred place and the end of an era. So what is it, really? A celebration of imperial power? A record of conquest? Or a permanent reminder of loss? The evidence shows all of it exists at once, carved into the same monument. And that leads to a final question. When history is carved into stone, who gets to decide its meaning? Medieval cathedrals? Faith, or power display? That question rises with the towers themselves. These structures were built as houses of worship, spaces for prayer, ritual, and devotion. But they were never only that. Here's the reveal. Medieval cathedrals stood at the center of society. Not just spiritually, but politically and economically. They were places of worship, but also places of governance, trade, decision-making. Records show councils met inside them. Deals were made. Funds were managed. Here's the correction to the myth. Cathedrals were not built by faith alone. They required immense resources, money, labor, materials, often drawn from entire populations through taxes, donations, and obligations to the church. Their scale was not accidental. Height, light, size. They were designed to inspire awe, both spiritual and social. The evidence is visible in their construction itself. Projects lasting decades or even centuries. Funded by bishops, rulers, and communities. Driven by wealth, competition, and prestige between cities. And here's the deeper tension. Were they built to honor God? Or to demonstrate the power of those who claim to represent Him? The answer is not one or the other. It is both, layered into stone. Because in the medieval world, belief and power were not separate systems. They were the same structure. Rising together. Crusader monuments. Heroes, or invaders? That question depends on perspective. Across Europe and the Middle East, monuments from the Crusades still stand, castles, churches, tombs, and ruins. Here's the reveal. To those who built them, these monuments represented faith, sacrifice, and holy purpose. They marked journeys, victories, devotion. Effigies of knights show both prayer and armor, piety and war combined in a single image. But that is only one side of the story. Here's the correction to the myth. The Crusades were not a single narrative of heroism. They were complex campaigns involving conquest, violence, and competing claims over sacred land. In Western memory, Crusader monuments can symbolize religious commitment and medieval identity. In Middle Eastern perspectives, the same events are often remembered as invasion, conflict, and loss, an entirely different historical experience. The evidence lies not just in the structures themselves, but in how they are interpreted. The same castle can be seen as a fortress of faith, or a mark of occupation. And here's the deeper tension. Monuments do not change, but the meaning around them does. So the question remains. When we look at these structures today, are we seeing history as it was? Or as it has been remembered? Royal statues of absolute monarchs. Glory, or propaganda? That question is carved into stone. Across Europe and beyond, statues of kings stand elevated, larger than life, unmoving, permanent. But what were they meant to show? Here's the reveal. In the age of absolute monarchy, rulers did not rely only on armies or laws. They relied on image. Power had to be seen, repeated, reinforced. Here's the correction to the myth. These statues were not neutral tributes. They were carefully designed symbols of authority, part of a broader system that presented the monarch as dominant, legitimate, and often divinely chosen. Pose mattered. Height mattered. Placement in public space mattered. Kings were often depicted larger than others, positioned above the viewer, surrounded by symbols of control, crowns, armor, or divine imagery. The message was consistent. This power is natural. This rule is justified. This authority is permanent. Here's the deeper context. In systems of absolute monarchy, rulers concentrated political control and often justified it through ideology, especially the idea that their authority came from a higher, unquestionable source. Art, architecture, and monuments became extensions of that idea. Not decoration, communication. And here's the tension. When we look at these statues today, are we seeing the ruler as they were? Or as they wanted to be seen? Colonial monuments. Discovery, or domination? That question changes what these monuments represent. Across continents, statues and memorials were built to honor explorers, governors, and empires. They tell a story of arrival, expansion, achievement. But whose story is it? Here's the reveal. Many colonial monuments were created to celebrate exploration and imperial success, what was often called discovery. Here's the correction to the myth. These narratives frequently overlook the experiences of indigenous populations, displacement, violence, and loss that accompanied colonial expansion. The same event can carry two meanings. One of achievement, and one of domination. Here's the deeper context. Research shows that monuments play a role in shaping identity and belonging, by choosing what is remembered and how it is framed. Colonial monuments, in particular, often reinforce a selective version of history, one that emphasizes power while minimizing its consequences. And that creates tension. Because what is visible in public space feels official, permanent, accepted. But visibility is not neutrality. So what are these monuments really preserving? History? Or a perspective on history? And as societies reconsider them today, a new question emerges. Is the goal to remove them? Or to finally see what they were always leaving out? The Statue of Liberty. Freedom for all? That question stands beneath the torch. The Statue of Liberty rises as a global symbol of liberty, visible, iconic, unquestioned. But what did it originally represent? Here's the reveal. When it was conceived in the 19th century, the monument was linked to ideas of freedom, democracy, and the abolition of slavery. A broken chain lies at its feet, part of its original symbolism. Over time, its meaning expanded. For millions of immigrants arriving in New York, it became a sign of welcome. A promise of opportunity. But that promise was not universal. Here's the correction to the myth. While the statue symbolized liberty, the reality of early America included exclusion, legal, social, and political, affecting many groups, including women, indigenous peoples, and formerly enslaved individuals. The evidence is not hidden. Historical records show unequal rights persisted long after the statue's dedication. Even as it stood in the harbor, many people it symbolized freedom for could not fully access it. And its meaning kept evolving. The famous association with immigration, the idea of a welcoming mother of exiles, was not part of the original design, but developed later through cultural interpretation and public memory. So what does the statue represent? A symbol of freedom? A promise of equality? Or a reminder of ideals not yet fully realized? And here's the deeper tension. If a monument represents liberty, what happens when reality doesn't match the symbol? National War Memorials, 19th century. Unity, or selective memory? That question sits quietly beneath stone, bronze, and marble. In the 19th century, war memorials became increasingly common across Europe, especially after major conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars and later colonial and national wars. Here's the reveal. These monuments were designed to honor sacrifice and celebrate national victory. They presented war as service, duty, heroism. Here's the correction to the myth. They rarely captured the full experience of conflict. Internal divisions, political disagreement, civil tension, colonial resistance, or unpopular wars, were often absent from the final narrative carved into stone. Instead, memorial design focused on unity and shared identity. The names of the dead, the symbols of the nation, the idea of collective sacrifice. But that unity was constructed because societies emerging from conflict often needed a single, stabilizing story. Here's the deeper tension. Who is included in remembrance? And who is quietly left outside it? The evidence is not hidden, it is structural. Monuments reflect decisions, what to emphasize, what to simplify, and what to omit in order to create meaning from chaos. So what do these memorials truly preserve? Grief? Victory? Identity? Or a carefully shaped version of all three? And as new generations stand before them, the question doesn't disappear. It only becomes more important. The Lincoln Memorial. End of slavery, or unfinished story? That question still lingers beneath the marble. The memorial honors Abraham Lincoln and his role in preserving the Union and ending slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's the reveal. It stands as one of the most powerful public symbols of freedom and national unity in the United States. Here's the correction to the myth. Legal abolition did not automatically produce equality. After the Civil War, freedom expanded on paper, but social, political, and economic inequality persisted for decades through segregation laws, disenfranchisement, and systemic exclusion. The evidence is visible in historical timelines and civil rights records stretching from Reconstruction through the 20th century. And the memorial itself became part of that ongoing history. Here's the deeper context. The Lincoln Memorial was designed as a neoclassical structure, echoing ancient temples to represent democratic ideals and permanence. It was completed in 1922, nearly 6 decades after Lincoln's assassination, and quickly became a symbolic stage for national reflection. But its meaning evolved over time. It became a focal point for civil rights history. From Marian Anderson's 1939 concert to Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, it transformed into a space where the gap between ideals and reality was publicly confronted. So what does it represent? A completed promise? A turning point? Or a reminder that promises can outlast the moment they were made? And here's the tension. The monument honors progress, while also standing where that progress was still being demanded. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial. Memory of tragedy, or warning? That question defines how this site is understood today. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, most visibly the preserved ruins of the atomic bomb dome, stands in the center of Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park. Here's the reveal. It is preserved not as a rebuilt monument, but as a ruin, frozen at the moment after destruction. A direct physical trace of the atomic bombing on August 6, 1945. Here's the correction to the myth. The memorial does not present a single, simplified narrative of the event. Instead, it focuses heavily on the human impact, victims, objects, and personal stories, while the broader wartime context is often less central within the main memorial experience itself. This creates an interpretive tension, because the same event can be framed in multiple ways. A military action within a global war. A humanitarian catastrophe. A turning point in international history. The evidence exists for all of these contexts in historical records. But the memorial itself chooses emphasis. Here's the deeper question. What does it mean to remember an event through its consequences more than its causes? And what gets shaped, intentionally or not, by that choice? The memorial space itself reflects this balance. Designed for reflection and peace education, it invites visitors to confront destruction while also considering the broader idea of nuclear war and its long-term consequences. And here is the tension that remains. Is this space primarily documenting what happened? Or shaping how it should be understood? Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Names without narrative. That design choice changes everything. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., is not built around scenes of battle. Not statues of victory. Not a chronological story of war. Here's the reveal. It is built around absence. Here's the correction to the myth. The memorial lists more than 58,000 names of U.S. service members who died or remain missing during the Vietnam War, inscribed chronologically rather than alphabetically. There is no rank. No unit. No explanation of cause. Only names, and dates. The structure itself is two long black granite walls that descend into the earth and rise again, forming a quiet V-shape. Here's the deeper tension. This was not a traditional approach. It was controversial at first. Critics expected a heroic monument, figures, flags, clear narrative. Instead, they encountered reflection. Literally. The polished stone reflects the viewer back at the names. So what does that do to memory? It removes interpretation from the monument itself. And places it onto the visitor. Because without a story carved into stone, you are left to confront the names directly. Here's the question that remains. Does silence preserve truth more honestly than explanation? Or does it leave too much unsaid? Berlin Wall Memorial. Division remembered, but how? That question sits at the center of this landscape. The Berlin Wall Memorial preserves a fragment of a city once split in two. Here's the reveal. It does not simply commemorate the fall of the wall. It reconstructs the system that made division possible. Here's the correction to the myth. The Berlin Wall was not just a barrier. It was a border regime, complete with surveillance zones, patrol routes, and a heavily controlled death strip between East and West Berlin. The memorial highlights this physical reality in detail, preserving sections of the border and documenting how movement, escape, and daily life were restricted. But memory is selective by nature. Here's the tension. The memorial emphasizes human suffering, attempts to escape, deaths at the border, separation of families, because these are the most direct, visible consequences of division. At the same time, the broader political architecture that created the wall, the Cold War power struggle, ideological conflict between East and West, can feel more distant, more abstract within the visitor experience. So what emerges is not a full reconstruction of history, but a focused interpretation of it. Here's the deeper question. When a memorial chooses what to show clearly, what does it inevitably leave in the background? Robben Island. Prison turned symbol. That transformation is not automatic. It is earned over time. Robben Island lies off the coast of South Africa, near Cape Town. Here's the reveal. For centuries, it was not a single-purpose site, but a shifting one: prison, leper colony, military base, and isolation zone. Here's the correction to the myth. Its most powerful meaning today comes from a later period, when it became a maximum security prison under apartheid, holding political prisoners. Among them was Nelson Mandela, who spent 18 years on the island. But here's where the story becomes more complex. Here's the deeper tension. At the time, the island functioned as a tool of separation, designed to isolate, restrict, and suppress political opposition under apartheid rule. And yet today, it is preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, framed as a symbol of resilience, democracy, and the eventual rejection of that system. So what changed? Not the geography. Not the buildings. But the meaning assigned to them. That shift raises a difficult question. Does a place become meaningful because of what happened there? Or because of how later generations choose to interpret what happened? Confederate monuments, USA. Heritage, or controversy? That question has followed these monuments for more than a century. Across the United States, statues honoring Confederate leaders and soldiers still stand in public spaces. Here's the reveal. Many of these monuments were not built immediately after the Civil War. Here's the correction to the myth. Historical records show that the majority were erected decades later, especially between the late 19th century and mid-20th century, during the Jim Crow era of racial segregation and political disenfranchisement. Earlier memorials tended to mourn war dead in cemeteries. But later monuments shifted in purpose, placing leaders in civic spaces like courthouses and town squares, where they became visible symbols of public identity. Here's the deeper context. These structures were often funded and promoted by organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and supported by local governments and civic groups. Historians note that their construction aligned with periods of racial tension and major political change, particularly after Reconstruction and during the Civil Rights era. That timing raises a difficult question. Were these monuments simply about remembering the past? Or about shaping the present at the time they were built? Here's the tension. To some, they represent regional heritage and historical memory. To others, they reflect a selective narrative of the Civil War, one that emphasizes valor while minimizing the central role of slavery and its aftermath. And that is where interpretation divides. Because monuments do not only reflect history. They reflect the moment in which they were created. Statue removals in Europe. Erasing history, or correcting it? That question sits at the center of a growing public debate across Europe. From Britain to Belgium and beyond, statues linked to colonial figures have been removed, relocated, or recontextualized in recent years. Here's the reveal. Many of these removals accelerated after renewed public scrutiny of colonial history, especially following global protests in 2020. Here's the correction to the myth. Statue removal is not generally about eliminating historical record. It is about changing public representation, what is displayed in shared civic space, and what those displays are understood to mean. Across Europe, examples include statues of colonial-era figures such as King Leopold II in Belgium being defaced or taken down, reflecting intensified debates about colonial legacy and public memory. Here's the deeper context. Historians note that monuments are not fixed historical documents. They are constructed in specific political moments and often reflect the values of the era in which they were erected, not necessarily the full complexity of the past they represent. This is why their removal is rarely framed as forgetting history, but rather as reinterpreting memory in public space. And yet the tension remains. For some, removing statues feels like confronting neglected histories of empire, slavery, and exploitation. For others, it raises concerns about whether visible symbols of the past are being lost from everyday public life. So the question is not only what is removed, but what replaces it. A monument taken down does not end the debate. It often begins a new one. How should societies remember histories that are still being questioned? Rhodes Must Fall movement. Who deserves a statue? That question is not just about stone or bronze. It is about memory itself. In 2015, a protest began at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, targeting a statue of Cecil Rhodes. Here's the reveal. The movement quickly expanded beyond a single monument. It became a broader debate about history, education, and representation in public space. Here's the correction to the myth. It was not simply a campaign about removing one statue. It was part of a wider call to reconsider how colonial history is represented in institutions shaped by that past. The statue itself, installed decades after Rhodes' death, had already long carried contested meaning on campus, seen by some as heritage, and by others as a symbol of colonial legacy. Here's the deeper context. The protest gained momentum through direct action, student organizing, and public debate, eventually leading to the statue's removal in April 2015. But its influence did not stop there. The movement spread internationally, reaching institutions like Oxford, where similar debates emerged about how colonial figures are remembered in academic and public spaces. And here is the tension at the center of it. Monuments are not only about the past they depict. They are also about the values of the present that choose to display them. So the question shifts again. Is a statue a form of remembrance? Or a form of endorsement? And who gets to decide the difference? Indigenous memorials. Stories finally told. That phrase suggests completion. But many of these memorials point in a different direction, toward stories still being recovered, still being reinterpreted. Across countries like Canada and Australia, Indigenous memorials have become more visible in public space in recent decades. Here's the reveal. Many are not traditional statues or heroic figures. They are installations, landscapes, or symbolic forms designed to represent absence, memory, and survival. Here's the correction to the myth. These memorials are not simply new monuments added to history. They are responses to histories that were long underrepresented in public commemoration, especially colonization, displacement, and cultural loss. One of the most significant examples is the Aboriginal Memorial in Australia, composed of 200 hollow log coffins, created to commemorate Indigenous lives lost during and after colonization. It was developed by artists from Arnhem Land and installed in a national museum context as a form of collective remembrance rather than individual portraiture. Unlike many traditional war or national monuments, Indigenous memorials often emphasize continuing presence rather than closure. They reflect the idea that history is not only something in the past, but something still carried in language, land, and community. In places like Canada, repatriation efforts and memorial practices are also linked to returning cultural objects and remains taken during colonial periods, highlighting that remembrance is not only symbolic, but also material and ongoing. And here's the tension. Some memorials aim to stabilize memory into a fixed story. But Indigenous memorials often resist that finality. They ask something more open-ended. Who is allowed to be remembered in public space? Who tells that story? And what happens when memory was interrupted in the first place? Digital memorials. Memory goes online. That shift is already happening, quietly, and at scale. Where remembrance once depended on stone, place, and physical presence, it now extends into digital space. Here's the reveal. Digital memorials are online platforms, pages, and interactive spaces created to preserve and share the memory of a person or event. They can include photos, biographies, messages, candles, timelines, and even virtual gatherings, accessible from anywhere in the world. Here's the correction to the myth. They are not just web pages of grief. They function as evolving archives of personal and collective memory, continuing long after physical ceremonies end. Some platforms allow families and communities to contribute over time, turning a single memorial into a shared, ongoing record of remembrance. Here's the deeper context. Unlike traditional monuments fixed in one location, digital memorials are not bound by geography. They can be accessed across borders, time zones, and generations, allowing participation from people who may never meet in person. But this shift introduces new questions. Here's the tension. If memory is now stored online, who controls it? Who moderates it? And what happens when platforms change, disappear, or decide what is visible? Because digital remembrance is not static. It is hosted, updated, sometimes even deleted. And here's the deeper question. When memory moves from stone to servers, does it become more permanent? Or simply more fragile in a different way? Future monuments. What will we choose to remember? That question is no longer abstract. It is already shaping how memory is designed. Monuments are changing, not only in form, but in function. Here's the reveal. Across recent studies and design practices, memorials are increasingly understood as evolving systems rather than fixed objects. They can be interactive, digital, temporary, or community-driven. Here's the correction to the old assumption. A monument is no longer always a single statue in a fixed location. It can be a space, a platform, a performance, or even a digital archive that changes over time. Here's the deeper shift. Modern approaches to commemoration increasingly focus on participation and multiple perspectives, rather than one official narrative carved into stone. Some designs even allow memory to evolve as new voices are added, or as societies reinterpret the past. And this creates a new tension. If memory is no longer fixed, what does permanence even mean? Because future monuments may not just ask us to remember. They may ask us to respond, to contribute, to revise. And that leads to the final question. When the next generation looks back at us, will they inherit monuments that tell a single story? Or living systems of memory that are still being written? History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And as societies change, so do the stories we preserve, and the ones we quietly set aside. Here's the closing question. What will we choose to remember next? Because history is never finished. It's always being written, in real time. Thank you for watching. If this video made you think differently, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who enjoy exploring history through a more critical lens. Your support helps us continue creating content that questions, investigates, and uncovers the layers beneath the surface of the past.